Weirding Way Media.
Welcome to episode 110 of the Filmumentaries podcast. This is Jamie Benning speaking to you here from my house in southeast London. I hope everyone's doing well and enjoying the podcast so far. If you're new here, welcome aboard. You've got a whole treasure trove of episodes to explore, over 100 conversations with some of the most talented folks in the film industry. And to all my regular listeners, a massive thank you for your continued support, especially those of you who support the podcast via Patreon. Patreon.com/Jamie Benning. You are the reason I can keep doing what I love, so thank you for that. Now, today's conversation is one I've had in the bag for a couple of months now. I had the absolute pleasure of sitting down with Andrew Whitehurst. Andrew's journey into the visual effects industry is one that really resonates with me, especially when he talks about his childhood fascination of all things movie magic and a certain BBC documentary. Yes, that one again. Like many of us, it all started with a spark of curiosity. He pursued that passion at art college and gained experience in various roles, which eventually led him becoming a visual effects artist. His early work on projects like Tomb Raider 2 and Troy paved the way for his role as VFX Supervisor on Ex Machina, ultimately winning him an Academy Award. In our conversation, we got to deep dive into Andrew's experience working on films like Ex Machina and Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. We talked about the challenges of creating realistic CGI characters and the meticulous attention to detail that's required for modern audiences. Andrew believes in the use of traditional tools like pencil and paper in the design process and sees the importance of looking beyond the screen to other forms of art for inspiration. Through our discussion, Andrew provided some great insights into the decision-making process for visual effects and how to strike that delicate balance between realism and audience expectations. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Andrew Whitehurst, and I'll be back at the end for a bit more jabbering on. Andrew, thanks for joining me today. How did you end up in the industry? Was it a love of movies? Was there a particular moment you can kind of pinpoint?
I can. Given what I ended up doing in terms of a project I worked on, there's a certain symmetry to it. There used to be a BBC TV science series in the 80s called Horizon, and each episode was on a different topic. And one week it was on visual effects, and I think this was about 1984. And they'd spent time at Industrial Light and Magic, and obviously at the time they were making the documentary, the project that was being worked on was Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. So I watched this thing, and I was, I guess, 9 about at the time, and my 9-year-old mind was blown because I wasn't dumb enough that I thought that movies were real, but I did think that people built full-size sets for everything, and the idea that you could make movies with models and paintings and animation and all of that stuff, it just hadn't crossed my mind. So that was a real awakening of here is the thing. And I liked making models, and I was interested in painting. And so I don't think I knew at that exact moment that I was going to be in visual effects. And honestly, I didn't really make the final decision that that's what I wanted to get into until I was at art college. But certainly that moment was the seed was planted, and I was very aware that there was this art and craft that maybe was something that you could do. But at that point, it was only ILM doing it, and the thought of me, a kid from Stoke, ending up in San Francisco seemed so absurdly remote that I don't think I really thought that it was realistic. But the idea was certainly there.
I remember that documentary, how to film the impossible.
Yes,
I
with the
think they
most
had it on
amazing pronunciation of Darth Vader you will ever hear
Darth
by
Vader, was it?
Darth Vader. Yes.
Yeah, and I also had a little badge that said Darth Vader lives on it, spelled incorrectly. I remember that show really, really, really well because I remember taping it off the TV, and that was what kind of sparked my interest. Really, I mean, I was like you say, what year were you born then, Andrew?
1975.
So I was born 76, so we're very close in age, June 76. So yeah, I remember thinking, oh wow, you can actually have a role in these films, like other people can have a role in films. It's not just the director and the actors. I didn't ever think that I could do that myself, like yourself, but it's interesting that show sparked so many people's imaginations that I spoke to over the years, people that have ended up in VFX, people that haven't, even people in my part of the TV industry, which is like live sport. So many of them I spoke to over the years know that show as like a jumping off point. And maybe like me, I didn't really know. I'm not particularly artistic, so I didn't know that a job would exist for me in ILM. But you obviously had that spark at that moment. What was the next step you took then? You went to art college, you say. Whereabouts was that?
Yeah, so I went to art college in Northampton and then up in Carlisle.
Mm.
I mean, the main reason for picking Carlisle was it was as far away as I could get from my parents without actually having to move to a different country. So, but it was a good course in that they had a range of really good equipment, and you were encouraged to try whatever you wanted. So some people's final major projects were a radio play, other people made short films, and my final major project was a animation that was a mixture of puppet animation. So I sculpted puppets out of clay and then cast them in plaster, and I ordered foam latex from Alec Tarantes. In London, they got sent up and made the entire kitchen stink for an afternoon whilst I made those, and I went and made armatures in the machine shop at college. And then that was combined with CG. So the college had got 3 Silicon Graphics machines in, and an awesome lecturer called Siobhan Foy, as she was then, Fenton as she is now, who I am still friends with. And Siobhan introduced me to Silicon Graphics machines and proper 3D software. So I'd grown up with Acorn Archimedes computers, and in is it BBC Micro, whatever the magazine was that was the kind of house mag for those sorts of computers, they would always have these yellow pages in the middle that would have software that you could type in yourself.
Yeah.
One of which was a ray tracer. So I did that, and I got obsessed and interested by that. And then I got my own machine with Lightwave on it. So my final major project was a mixture of Softimage done at college, Lightwave done in my student bedroom, and the puppet animation. That was my final film, and that's what was my first showreel. And that's what I took to London and singularly failed to get an artist job. So I ended up working as a runner, which I do not recommend. But
No, but it is a foot in the door, isn't it?
it's a foot in the door, and I'm really pleased I did it. And I will always have endless respect for anyone who has done it.
Yeah, I think I didn't enter as a run into my part of the industry. I went in as like a technical operator, doing camera and VT and stuff like that, but also loading trucks and making tea, which ultimately is what a runner is doing in a lot of these jobs. So I guess the question really is, how long does the runner job last? Like, you have to go for the absolute minimum possible if you can.
I also, sharing my unerring sense of timing. I graduated just as the movie Lost in Space was being wrapped up, and that was a really interesting project for British visual effects, because there were a lot of small companies that were very used to making commercials, and that's what their bread and butter was. And none of them were big enough on their own to sort of tackle film visual effects work. But essentially, it became kind of UK PLC for doing that project.
Yeah.
And the company which I initially worked for was Electric Image, who was one of the companies who did the Jupiter spaceship for that movie.
Right.
But the expectation was that Soho collectively would do a good job for sensible money, and then film work would come rolling in, and it just didn't happen. So all of these companies had expanded and bought film recorders and scanners and all the rest of it with the thought that this was going to be the future, and it didn't happen. So the company I worked for went bust. Um, and that meant that the whole of Soho was really quiet for a good couple of years, 2-3 years. So after I'd finished being a runner, I actually ended up basically doing graphic design for DVD menus for about 2 years, which was interesting. And the company, that company was actually an offshoot of Electric Image, who'd gone under. So we still had the Silicon Graphics machine. So I was still making things either for my own reel or to make interesting animated menus.
What projects did you work on with the DVD menu stuff?
We did all of the first lot of Bonds, which were fun, and they had a bit of money to spend, so that we got to do some nice animated titles and menu graphics for those. We did Doctor Who.
It was quite a thing, wasn't it, in that period? So this is like what, 2001, 2002?
Not even. I mean, more like 99, 2000.
Okay. Yeah, it was a big thing, wasn't it? Like everyone was trying to sort of show off their best skills in the menu and the presentation of it, and then it sort of went away for a number of years.
Well,
didn't
I mean, DVDs kind of went away, so it's
it did, but I think there was a period where it was just like a picture and some text, and you would like scroll down it. But I remember those days because you'd have like little hidden Easter eggs and things and sub menus. Yeah,
they put. Somebody sent me a link to, and I'd forgotten we'd done this, sort of fast forwarding, but I did Troy as a visual effects artist.
Yeah.
And there's a massive shot, a big helicopter shot we did for the trailer and the Super Bowl and all the rest of it. It's got the whole, 1,000 ships at sea, 3 of which are real. And that shot which number for the shot ID number was WP2610, which I can still remember however many years later, which gives you an indication of how much of a widowmaker it was. And it drove us so balmy that eventually we just had to do something to kind of break the tension, and everything was instanced, so we could put any geometry we wanted in. So we quickly modeled a whole load of rubber ducks, and so we re-rendered the shot with 1,000 gigantic rubber ducks bobbing along, which ended up as an Easter egg on the DVD menu. And somebody sent me this going, "Is this real?" And I had genuinely forgotten that we had done it, and it's like, oh yeah, we did do that. But yeah, so DVD menus was a real thing for a bit. But the whole time I was doing that, it's like I can do graphic design to a standard, but it's not really what I love. So I was always working on my reel in my spare time because I'd still got the computer with Lightwave on, and just doing the usual thing that aspiring visual effects artists do is, update your reel, write it out onto beta SP tape and the machine room, take the beta SP tape down to Stanley Productions on Wardour Street, pay money to have those duped onto 25 VHS tapes, and then send them all off to the usual suspects and wait for if you're lucky, the rejection letters, or usually just kind of, absolute silence. I used to keep a box file with all of my rejection letters in as a kind of, reminder. And I did that for a while. And then I got a phone call from one of the animators from Electric Image who said there is a company being set up to make a animated kids TV series featuring the mascots for the upcoming Japan-South Korea World Cup.
Right.
You should give them a bell, because he says, I'll vouch for you, and they desperately need people, so they're you're in with a shot. Which I did, and I got the job. And that was brilliant. I think it was about a year and a half. And we started small and expand. We started small, sort of do the trailer to go to MIPCon, which is the conference where people go and flog TV shows to people who will buy TV shows. And then it expanded out. So I sort of went from being a very junior artist to being somebody responsible for people quite quick, because the company expanded very fast. But it was such an education in learning how to work quickly, and that's something that I think when you're a student you don't understand.
Mm.
And nor should you, because you've got more time and you shouldn't be worrying about that. But also, you are just, or at least I was, blithely unaware of how fast you have to work to survive as a professional artist, particularly if you're doing something like TV.
Mm.
I mean, I was lighting and rendering 10, 15 shots a day, which you had to just to get through it all. And we had this big stadium that was filled with thousands of characters, and that was the one thing that we were able to use RenderMan for. So everything else was just done with the default renderer in Maya.
Mm.
But that was my first exposure to RenderMan, which is the preeminent renderer that's used in movie visual effects. So I started to learn that, which was interesting. So I did that, and then that company then started work on a animated film for a Norwegian director, and that basically went wrong after a while, and that company went bust. And then I freelanced for a bit and did some Hallmark channel idents and other bits of commercials work. And then I heard that Double Negative were looking for people, and so I went to Double Negative, and my first project there, and so my first actual gig as a visual effects artist was Tomb Raider 2.
Mm.
And that was 2000, I think,
Cradle
maybe
of life.
2000. Yes, great.
Yeah.
Yes, somebody offered to pay me £10 because one of the things I did was the titles for it to change it to say Cradle of Filth, but I refused to take the money.
And in what capacity were you involved in that film?
Sort of generalist 3D artist, and in as much as pretty much everybody then was a generalist artist, I think I was employee number 62 at Double Negative, and that's including the folks running the company and the accountants and everybody else. I mean, we were on one floor in Shaftesbury Avenue with ducting running everywhere, so it looked like the set from Brazil. And yeah, so that was my first job as a visual effects artist.
Mm. And when did that sort of, you mentioned like everyone was a generalist back then. When did the industry to kind of get divided up into those individual roles? Was it based on the complexity of the shots that were needed, or was it just the industry got organized? How did that
bit of both, and also the company's got much bigger.
Yeah.
And so you tend to want to make departments because it's a sensible way of structuring a larger company.
Mm.
And the work got more, as you say, the work got more complicated, so people tended to want to focus on something particular. I mean, most companies still have generalists. I mean, ILM certainly has generalists, which is here's 3 tricky shots that we can't really pipeline, make this problem go away kind of people, which is a great thing to have, and it's a lot of fun. But it's even with generalists, you'll find that they'll specialize to a degree. So you do not want me doing character animation for you. I am not good at that, but I can model things and rig things and certainly light and render things, and that's kind of where I tended to devote myself, was the sort of lighting, rendering, look dev, making stuff look nice kind of end of things. But all of the other things I can do to a standard, which as a supervisor is very useful, because even if I don't think that I'm good enough to actually do the work, I know enough to be able to have a sensible conversation with someone who is, and to be able to understand what their problems might be, and then maybe if we're filming something, try and shoot things in a way that will help. So I think I definitely find that my background as a generalist meant that knowing how most of the sausage is made was really useful, and is still really useful.
Because looking at, I mean, I know IMDb is not always the most accurate filmography, but it seems you jumped to senior visual effects on Troy, having been technical director on Lara Croft, Tomb Raider 2, and then you're sort of seemingly climbing the ladder quite quickly. Was that you? I think you even mentioned on that that video for was it for the World Cup, you said, or for the
it was a kids TV series,
which I think I sort of have vague memories of, actually. but you sort of were managing people quite quickly. Is that something that sort of came naturally to you? Did you see the sort of ladder ahead of you?
No, I mean I have never really had a planned career progression.
Mm.
Um, Not because I don't have any ambition, but more because I think the key to happiness in any creative endeavor is to learn to enjoy the process and to learn to enjoy the now. And most people I know, or most people who I have met, who have been ultra goal focused, tend to be fairly unhappy
Yes.
because if you get to that goal, then you get 10 minutes of satisfaction. I mean, this also applies to awards chasers, I think. But you tend to get people who are happy for 10 minutes and they say, well, what's the next thing? And then they're miserable until they get that. And then they get another 10 minutes of satisfaction, which doesn't sound like a particularly appealing way
Mm.
of living a life to me. Um, I was lucky in that when I joined the industry, it was still pretty small. And I mean, I wasn't writing at the ground floor. There's certainly a generation of people who are, 5 years older than me who are still working.
Mm.
But it was little, and then it grew pretty quickly. So you inevitably, if you had any aptitude in talking to people, were pushed in that general direction. And certainly, I didn't chase any of the roles that I got. People said, "Would you be interested in doing this? Would you be interested in leading this? Would you be willing to CG soup this? Would you, would be willing to try being a visual effects supervisor?"
Mm.
And I'm, try anything once. Why not?
Mm.
And if I decided I didn't like it, then I'd go back to doing what I was doing before. And I mean, I've got friends who are the same age as me who are, let's say a compositor, and they're just like, I like comping shots. It's like, I'm now super experienced and really senior, so just give me the crazy hard shots, and I'm going to do those, and that's what I want to do. And it's like, totally get that.
Mm.
But I was just like, yeah, why not? I'll give it a go, see what happens. What's the worst can happen? I can get fired, all right, and then try again.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, people just asked me to do things, and I repeatedly said yes.
I think that's the thing, isn't it? People often don't develop in their careers, not because the opportunity doesn't arise, but often we're our own worst enemies in that we're not sort of agile enough and not kind of willing enough to throw ourselves into things and fail. If
Yeah,
if failure occurs, that's how
and
you
failure
learn.
will occur.
Yeah.
I mean, you are gonna. I mean, I say you are. I have screwed up stuff. It's inevitable, and you learn from that. And provided you screw up less than you get it right, then you've probably got a career.
Mm. And it seems like, again, looking at your sort of filmography, that you've worked with amazing directors over the years. Wolfgang Peterson on Troy and Mike Newell on Harry Potter. Was it Goblet of
I
Fire?
got a really good final out of Wolfgang. Um, we, I don't do it anymore, but I used to do Iaido,
Mm.
which is a samurai-based martial art where you use a sword. And so on training nights, I would have all wrapped up in the appropriate, police okayed packaging, my
Mm.
sword next to my desk. And Wolfgang came around visiting to come and see what we were all doing, and was looking at what we were all up to, and was looking at the shot. And the shot I was working on was basically done. And he pointed at this and went, "What's that?" And I said, "A samurai sword." He went, "Yeah, no notes," and walked off. So it's like, if you want to get a final out of a director, I find having edged weaponry to hand is really quite helpful.
And do you think, like, I know directors talk to each other, there's a bit of a community of directors. Do you think that your name kind of got around between Wolfgang and Mike Newell and Edgar Wright and Sam Mendes, that you were the guy to work for on this particular show? Because I know even within particular companies, like I know Pablo Hellman works with Fincher and Scorsese, for instance. He's not going to necessarily go and do another Star Wars or whatever, but do you think that there is that kind of word of mouth about you and your sort of level of capability?
Genuinely, I have no clue.
Mm.
I mean, I've as a visual effects supervisor, I've always worked for a company, so I've either been
Mm.
at Double Negative or at Industrial Light and Magic. And if you're working for a company, it's in the company's interest to pair you up with a director who you are going to, get along with as a person, but also creatively. So, my background is very arty, and that's my sort of shtick. Um, I like the technology, but a lot of visual effects supervisors come from an engineering or a computer science background, and so they see things in a slightly different way, maybe than than I do. I mean, I do programming, but I would not call myself a programmer. I know enough to get myself in trouble, and then I know what to go and ask somebody who doesn't know what they're doing to get me out of trouble. So I think there's an element of the company that you're working for trying to make sure that they're setting themselves up for success, because if I get on well with the director and we have a good working relationship, that usually results in a happier crew because they're going to get better notes, and it's just everything is less fraught. And then over time, you have enough movies in your resume that a studio who's looking for someone, or a director, can kind of see the sorts of things that you've done and get a feeling for the kind of things that you should be good at. And I'm sure some of them talk to people that I've worked with before, and hopefully they are kind.
And forgive my ignorance, but as a supervisor, VFX supervisor, do you ever get to kind of pick your team as well? Because you might need, this guy's good batting, this guy's good bowling, this guy's good fielding.
I mean, casting is very important. It's always a negotiation, because I'm never going to get literally everybody I want, but it's I definitely get a say, and again, because it makes sense that if it's people I know that I'll get on with, then we maybe already have a shorthand, which means that we will get results quicker. I mean, that was certainly one of the things that when I was doing Ex Machina, about a third of the shots were done by the studio that Double Negative had at Singapore at that time. And Max, who was the guy who was out there, who was the CG soup out there, I'd worked with in London a bunch of times. And so he and I already had a shorthand, which meant that when I knew he was on the project, it's like, okay, I'm not in any way nervous. The fact that this whole working relationship is going to be over, I don't even think we had Zoom then. I think it might actually have been real phone calls.
Maybe Skype.
Maybe. I don't even think we had Skype. I think it was genuinely over the phone. But I had the confidence because I knew him and we'd worked together, and he understood my shorthand when I was describing things, and I knew that he would get what I was trying to say. So it does help. But then on the other hand, you don't want to close yourself off to working with someone new who might end up being amazing.
Yeah, of course. I mean, on Ex Machina, I mean, that was a hugely ambitious film for its time. 15 million budget or something. I think it made more than double, but that kind of came out of nowhere, that film. People didn't expect that. I mean, you won the Academy Award that year with some pretty stiff competition. What was that like working with Alex Garland? Because he's a particularly visual director, isn't he?
He is.
Was there a lot of previs, a lot of concept work before?
No previs. Handful of boards, but not really.
Why no previs? What was the thinking?
Because
cost.
Partly cost, but also it's a movie that is a sequence of conversations between people. And what we needed to do was design the way we were going to execute the visual effects in a way that Alex and Rob Hardy, the DP, could just shoot it like a regular piece of drama and not worry about the visual effects. So there's no green screen or blue screen in that movie either.
Very different approach.
But it's the right approach for that. And it's also the right approach because we only had 6 weeks to shoot it. So we were doing between 15 and 25 setups a day, which is a lot for anyone who doesn't know. I mean, most movies you may be doing 5 or 6. So we had to be fast, which if you're looking at something, you go, oh, well, we need to set up a blue screen for this. It's like, well, that takes time. And it's like, we just don't have it. So the way that we approached it was, well, look, let's get heavily into concepts and think about design to come up with a design for the Ava character that is going to help us in post, but also is going to have uh, the required qualities to make it shootable as drama.
Mm.
So, for example, we did things like around the wrists and the upper arms, there are sort of these O-rings in the design of the costume that, in story logic, is where the skin that she puts on herself at the end attaches. But what it was for us was a whole series of bands around her body that we could use as tracking markers.
Right.
So there was a lot of thinking about that kind of stuff ahead of time. I mean, the one thing that made life complicated was the head, which I'll come to in a minute. But what it meant was we were able to come up with a shooting approach that was very repeatable. So we would shoot the drama for 3 takes. Generally, everything was 3 takes. So 2 takes for Alex, and then 1 takes for the actors to try something different if they wanted to, and then we move on to the next setup. But we would always shoot a clean plate at the end of each setup, and then all of the usual balls and that kind of stuff. And it meant that we got into a groove and into a rhythm, and it meant that we were getting everything that we were going to need to put it together afterwards without treading on the actors or the way that Rob and Alex wanted to stage the action. The head was tricky because in the original design, and again, it was a budget saving approach, it was everything from the shoulders up was supposed to be in camera. So Alicia was wearing quite a lot of prosthetics on her head, and it was hard because it was a really, really hot summer. Rob likes his tungsten lighting. So, you could roast chickens on that soundstage if you wanted to. It was hot.
Was that shot here then? Not where was that?
Yeah, shot at Pinewood.
Okay, yeah.
4 weeks at Pinewood and then 2 weeks on location in Norway. And the budget saving thought was if we make everything that's above the shoulders on the Ava character practical, then everything that's close-ups in camera. Yay, happy days. And what happened was that wasn't creatively satisfying for Alex because he wanted the audience in literally every single shot to be very aware that they were looking at a robot. And what happened was that all productions do this, is that they will put a contingency fund together for any additional photography after there's been editing for a while. If you realize, it would be great to have a shot of this, or this scene doesn't quite make sense, so let's go and get some extra bits for it. Anyway, the editing was going great, and it was pretty apparent that we weren't going to need any additional photography. So Alex's thought was, well, let's use this money and let's do the head as CG as well for certainly the behind the facial mask, which meant, and that's the only bit that I designed on my own. Everything else about Ava is a very, very collaborative effort from Jock, who did the earliest concepts before visual effects was even on the job, to all of the in-house concept artists at Double Negative and me and other people, and building her. But the head I had to design in about a week. So I just did a whole bunch of really rough thumbnails of thoughts of things that ways we could approach it, and showed them to Alex, and I hate that one, I quite like that one, that's quite like this bit of that one. And then I went and did a nice piece of concept art that would be acceptable to send to the studio, so to say, hey, can we use this money to do this? And they said yes. So that then suddenly became a whole bunch of extra shots, because all of the close-ups are on camera, but then we also have to do every other shot that she's in extra work to. So that was the only curveball that we hadn't planned for. But because we'd shot clean plates for everything, it's like, okay, well, it's basically more of the same. But it worked out, and it was creatively an incredibly rewarding project because everybody was pulling in the same direction. It was tiny production. We all got to know each other really quickly. Small crew, both for shooting it and also small crew at Double Negative, working for a long time. I did all of the look dev for Ava, and I lit and rendered quite a few of the shots, and I did a bunch of the effects sims. And it was just like, it was a really lovely way to work. And it's the last project where I got to do a lot of hands-on work. So it was an absolute joy to do, and the movie ended up pretty great. So it was just all around a really, really lovely experience.
Was there a particular kind of ethos on the look of Ava? Because I remember at the time thinking she doesn't look like a robot that I've seen before. It
Yeah,
didn't
the
seem
rule.
like it was derivative.
Yes. So the one rule that I made for everybody, including me, who was working on the design, is no one's allowed to look at robots. It was just your band. Um,
So what did you look at?
well, we looked at a lot of sort of things like racing car suspension and like really high end road bikes. We looked at for sort of internal organs because they can be kind of any shape. So it's less of a mechanical aspect to that. We looked at a lot of modernist sculpture. So Constantin Brancusi there's definitely a lot of Constantin Brancusi in there, and human anatomy, because what I wanted and what we did, partly for psychological reasons, but there's a practical reason for it too, is that there's no cheating in Ava. So all of the joints work. There's
Yeah.
no cheaty intersectiony stuff. And the psychological reason for doing that is I think that people don't maybe consciously notice it, but they kind of subconsciously get a feeling when something is off. And so if everything is totally legit and you can see it, then I think it helps getting an audience to buy into the character. And then the practical reason for doing it, and it's not actually in the finished film, it's one of the few scenes that did get cut, is there is a scene where the two male characters are in the lab where Avas are being built, and there's a gurney with all of the skeleton of another Ava laid out there, and that was fabricated, 3D printed and chromed and all the rest of it, and fabricated for real. And that was a wonderful moment to walk onto the set that day to see something that we'd only ever fiddle with in a computer, actually realized and lying out there, and everything was articulated and you could move it all around. So that was definitely the design ethos for both practical and aesthetic / psychological reasons. Ultimately, I do have to say that, and I think when we were doing either Annihilation or Devs, I forget, Alex and I were talking about it, and we both agreed, because we both Mobius fanatics. There's a lot of Mobius in the design of Ava. Nothing deliberate. I mean, we weren't looking at any Mobius art. I don't think I looked at any Mobius stuff whilst I was working on that project.
It's part of you, though, I'm sure, by that
Yeah,
stage.
exactly. I can't help it. And him likewise. So it was a we banned ourselves from looking at robots, but I can't ignore the ultimate influence of the French maestro. So.
I think you're absolutely right, though. There's something about that movie and that character in particular where you really buy it. I mean, you've got Ava at one end where you understand the practicality of the way she's built, and you've got maybe like Iron Man at the other end, or Transformers, where things just disappear and fold into themselves and all that kind of stuff, which is fine for
Yeah.
that kind of movie. It does the job. But
It can't be fantastic, is the thing. Is you need to believe very quickly for the drama to land.
Exactly. Yeah, definitely. Which some of those other movies I just mentioned don't necessarily have big like dialogue drama moments. A lot of the action is physical stuff, isn't it?
Yeah.
You talked about rigging a 3D model. Just for, I mean, this isn't it's a sort of general film history podcast, but I've spoken to a lot of VFX people. But what can you explain in kind of layman's terms what you have to do with rigging? Let me see if I tell you what I think it is.
Mm-hmm.
See if I'm right. I genuinely don't know. I've not looked this up. So you've got the 3D model of a character. Is the rigging about sort of working out the extremities to which like a leg can lift and a knee can bend, so that when you come to animate it, you've got those parameters in place? Is that what rigging is?
Yes, kind of.
Right.
It's. I mean, the physical analog to think of is an animation puppet, like a Wallace or a Gromit, where you have a metal armature and then the outer form is placed around that. And when you're bending it into position, the armature is the thing that's holding the shape. So in CG, obviously nothing has any mass inherently. So you do have bones, and you can have other things that will deform a shape. But you're basically, the rigging process is to build the skeleton and the armature and the other controls that will bend the model in a way that we want it to, whether it's realistically or something else, but then also gives the animators the controls and the things to hold on so they can pose it and work intuitively and quickly. So it's a mixture of building something that gives an animator a user interface that they can work with to do their job, and to make something that will be able to be rendered at the end. It's not going to mangle a load of geometry into something that the renderer is going to go, no, thank you. So it's a very technical job, really, really technical job, but requires an eye for anatomy, so that when joints are bending, the way that the musculature moves, that's something that the rigging will do. All of that stuff comes together, and that's how you make a rig, and then that gets passed on to an animator.
Cool, that's good to know. And so you get the all the accolades for Ex Machina at that point. I mean, you're adding to a hell of a show reel now. At this point, is it much easier for you? I'm not suggesting any of it's easy, but is it simpler for you to kind of get the gigs that you want to get and work for the companies you want to work for at this point? Because I mean, you were up against, what were you up against? Mad Max, Fury
Mad
Road, was it?
Max,
The
Star
Martian,
Wars, Martian.
The Revenant, maybe.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, it was yes. It is an astonishing thing that happened. Easiest to get jobs. I don't know. I mean, I still don't get things now.
It's a dumb question, Andrew, but yeah.
So I don't think that's ever going to change. I mean, it's like any creative professional. It's like sometimes either the timing isn't right, or they think you aren't the right person for that particular job, or there's a whole bunch of reasons why it might not. I would be surprised if it hurt my prospects, but I can't honestly say that I suddenly noticed that the phone was ringing off the hook.
Yeah, I guess there's always a difficulty in succeeding to that level on such a low budget that it could force things in the wrong direction as well. So well, if they can do it for cheap, then we need to do it for cheaper on the next gig.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think maybe. I mean, for me, the project I did before Ex Machina was Skyfall, which was obviously a lot more expensive as a project. So I had, if someone was looking at my resume, then they would be seeing, oh, well, he's just done something that was a
huge,
really
yeah.
very expensive big action movie as well as this little one. So I'm very, I suppose the one thing that I am very consciously aware of trying to do with my career is I don't want to be typecast as being the person who does, tiny sci-fi movies or, whatever. There's a lot of things that I'm interested in. The thing that motivates me is helping people to tell interesting stories with hopefully beautiful pictures. And if we use the latest technology for that, yeah, great, very happy about that. If I'm using a pencil and a piece of paper to do a bunch of it, then I'm equally happy with that. The tool, I like tools. Tools are fun and they're nice things, but it's only what you can do with them that is actually of interest to me, rather than the technology per se.
Working on a film like Paddington would have been before Ex Machina or after?
Paddington was Paddington was at the end, I think, of Ex Machina, because that was a heady bit of overlap, because I was finishing up working on Ex Machina whilst I was starting to work on Paddington, which is quite the mental gear change when you're moving between those projects. And that's actually really hard, because it's so, any aspect of making a movie is so all encompassing of everything you've got to give, that finding the mental space to be able to shift into a completely different, production philosophy, aesthetic, story, all of the rest of it is really tiring.
Mm.
I mean, the work that we did on Paddington was two sort of smallish sequences that Framestore just didn't have the capacity to do. So
Right.
I was never doing the bear,
Mm.
but we were doing things like in the Royal Geographic Society. There's all of these pipes that Paddington stuffs a marmalade sandwich into. So we were doing, designing pipes and a sequence for sending a marmalade baguette through it.
Yeah. Okay.
And then we also did the bit at the beginning of the film where the home gets trashed in Peru. So Framestore were doing the bears, but we were doing all of the destruction and the environment. So it was time limited, and we were brought on pretty late. So they shot everything way before we got involved. So that was not anywhere near as a bigger production for us as Ex Machina had been. But it was interesting, and it was fun to design the sequence inside the Royal Geographic Society, which came in late because they hadn't figured out quite what they wanted. So nothing had been boarded or animatics for that. So as a matter of course, I always have little A6 notebooks in my pocket because I think on paper. And I literally just sat with Paul King I think it was one Saturday in the cutting rooms, and we just designed what the filing system was going to look like, what the shots would be. Literally just me doing little thumbnails in my book. And then I just walked back to double negative, got everybody around me. It's like, okay, everybody, look at the tiny notebook. It's like, go and build that. And that's how we did it. But it's on a small project where you can do that. It's actually a really lovely way to work.
Yeah,
but that as an approach is something that often works. I mean, on Indiana Jones, I mean, I have the same types of notebooks in my pocket still. I mean, I have a shelf in this office of all my notebooks from projects going back, I don't know, 10, 15 years. And the idea in the opening sequence of the train that they are on going over a viaduct that gets bombed and then the train sort of crashes into it was a late addition. And I think that was a Steven Spielberg suggestion actually that Jim liked. And so Jim sort of says, Andrew, we've got this new thing. How are we going to do this? How are we going to do this? And we were shooting at Pinewood already at this point. So I was between takes. I was just sketching viaducts with trains and things and showing it to Jim and saying, well, it could be like this. And you go, oh, no, that's just too much destruction. And so I go and redraw something and show him and be like, oh, yeah, maybe that could work. And it meant that at the end of that day, I could take a phone picture of the drawings that he'd liked, send them to ILM and say, hey, okay, right, can we give this to a concept artist to make something more finished that we can get studio sign off? And we made a whole bunch of good design decisions very quickly, very cheaply, just by scribbling things in a notebook. So it's often I'd still find that a notebook, a pencil and a couple of pens is a great way of getting conversations at the very least happening creatively with everybody who's involved. And sometimes you can actually do a bunch of the design work.
I just spoke to Nilo Rodis Jamiro, who I interviewed him a couple of years ago, and I interviewed him
a legend.
End of May, the legend. And I'm going to show you this, right? Give me 2 seconds. He talks about in the first interview I did with him, he talks about how just what you said, just starting with a blank piece of paper and a pencil or biro. He likes to draw with biro, and he sees it as some sort of filtering experience where you're getting all of the bad ideas out of yourself. What I wanted to show you here is I sent him a copy of a book I made about Return of the Jedi. And he said, "Oh, I'll do a trade with you." And I got this the other day. And
wow,
phase one. There's a couple of other bits here. Another hand-drawn snow speeder.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Like a Probot kind of.
Yep. Design. Which the original one was a Mobius design.
An Ewok hanging onto a speed bike.
That's so gorgeous. Are you just kind of deciding what very expensive framing to go for?
This is exactly what I'm doing, Andrew. Like, I'm terrified that they're even in my house. Like a
Oh
Boba Fett
wow.
standing there, and like a ton. Oh, and he drew them for me, and he said I
Yeah.
loved drawing them for you. I was sort of
Oh
revisiting it, and he said I was putting on the music that I used to listen to when I was doing these drawings back during Empire Strikes Back.
yeah. Oh, that's beautiful.
I mean, it kind of blew my mind. But I mean, you're going to have this in years to come with all your notebooks. You know, you're going to be able to go to prop store and just pay your retirement. You know,
Oh, I think
but yeah,
about that.
there is something about just that pencil and paper. Is that something that you do for fun as well, or is it
Oh
just
yeah,
a
yeah.
work thing?
I mean,
Yeah.
there's on the shelf behind me. Some of the things back there are my drawings. Some of them are by real artists.
Oh, good for you.
Yeah. I mean, I draw. I draw for me. I occasionally draw for other people if they ask me to, and I draw for work a lot because as I said, I think on paper. So the the process of drawing. It depends what I'm drawing. So if it's a design process, then it's a way of very quickly trying a bunch of ideas out and figuring out what's dumb and what isn't.
Mm,
If it's something like, so when I started on Indiana Jones, I knew that we were going to be doing a serious de-aging job. The first thing that I did was I just did a whole bunch of drawings, paintings, and I made a maquette, which is up on the shelf up there, of Harrison's face, head, aged about 40. And the reason I did that is that one of the main things that was beaten into us at art college, and I am grateful to this day that they did this, was we were told if you want to visually understand something, you have to either draw it or sculpt it.
right.
Because there is no substitute for starting with a blank sheet of paper and then trying to make something that looks like something else, because it forces you to look. Because it's really easy to say, oh yeah, I will look through all the reference images. And it's like, yeah, but did you really look? And the answer is no, you didn't. And because you can't. I mean, you just have to spend the time, and the drawing forces you to do it. And sometimes you'll make a good likeness, and other times it will be dreadful. And I mean, there's a few out online. I did an interview for Lucasfilm when the film came out, and they asked me about it. So there's a few of my scribbles up there, and I have enough ego that I'm not going to show the absolutely god awful ones. But in truth, I probably learned more from the ones where the likeness is bad, because I can look at it and go, well, I was trying to make a good likeness and this really doesn't work. Why? It's like, oh, well, actually the angle of the mouth should be more like this, and the proportions of the nose is more this. And you learn. And that becomes super helpful when you're actually doing the shots, because I'm looking at something and it's like almost anyone can look at it and go, does it work or not? Yes or no. And obviously the first 50 times you do it, the answer is no. Unless you're unbelievably lucky. But the hard part is why. And if you spend the time and you really learn to look at something, then you absolutely can say, actually, no, the eye shape is more like this. And the phrase that I ended up using in my notes more than any others, and here's one for the facial anatomy fans, is the nasal labial folds, which is the creases that come down from the sides of your nose. Harrison Ford has very particular nasal labial fold shapes. So getting that right was really, really key. The other thing that I find, though, with drawing and doing concept art for more creative stuff, is that it makes you think about the piece of design more. So I know a lot of people who say that they quite like using, Midjourney or whatever it is as an illustrator. So it's like I'll design the thing in pencil and then I'll get it to render a nicer version of it, which I understand. I'm not for me. I like the process of making things, and I am highly reluctant to give that up. But the thing that I find if I'm doing a more finished piece is that you don't stop thinking about the design whilst you're doing that. So, if I'm painting highlights onto a plane or whatever, and I'm looking at it and I'm feeling that, I don't like the way that these highlights are falling on this, the way that that means that the underlying shape isn't quite right and I should go and rework that. Or I might be thinking, if it's a piece of concept art for a scene, and it's like, oh, well, we need to see the city burning in the background. Oh, that's interesting. I reckon on the other shots that they've done already shot for this sequence, they've backlit everything. Well, that's not going to work for this, because if we backlight everything, then the atmosphere is going to be backlit and we're not going to see the city. I need to have a conversation with the director of photography. those are sorts of things that happen when you spend the time to manually make something,
Mm.
because it's not just the doing of it, and it's not just the finished piece. In fact, the finished piece is arguably the least important bit. It's all of the thinking and feeling stuff that you're doing while you're making it, that then you can take forward, and you can then bring that to other people and say, hey, have you thought about this? Hey, what about this? Da, da, da. And then you can hopefully move together creatively with a lot more thought and understanding of where you're trying to get to.
Mm. It's interesting, that, isn't it? How just that process of kind of rendering an idea on paper or even verbally, like sometimes I'll say to my wife, I don't know whether to say this in the email or this in the email, and I might read it in my own head for 20 minutes and still can't decide. As soon as I say it out loud, I know which one I need to go with. There's
Yeah,
something about putting something external to you, getting that kind of feedback loop.
yeah.
um,
And also sometimes it's walking away from it. It's
yeah.
committing something to paper or whatever medium, going, I don't know, is this garbage? I can't
Mm,
tell.
mm,
And wandering off. And then you come back and you go, yes, that is actually genuinely terrible, Andrew. You should be ashamed. Or, well, these bits are terrible, but maybe there's something in that bit. And it's, if you haven't committed anything, if it's all abstract the whole time, you never move forward from that.
mm, mm. I know when I spoke to Dennis Muir, and he's a big proponent of going out in the world and seeing things.
Yeah,
Is that something that you do?
absolutely. I
Yeah.
I I, I love I walk a lot, partly for health reasons and partly to stop me going bonkers. And one of the main things is just looking at the world. And it's like it is impossible to be bored anywhere. There is always something interesting to look at. Why, this building. It's like, oh, well, I wonder why that was done that way, and I wonder, oh, is that original? Was that a bit extra? And
Mm,
there's just a lot of visual understanding that you can get, that you can store away for future use.
mm,
But it just engaging with the world, looking at natural phenomena. It's like, oh, that's
mm,
interesting. I mean, I remember again, Indy. I knew that we were going to be doing planes flying at night in a storm,
mm,
and on one of the tech recce's, we were flying down to Sicily, and it was hoying down with rain. And I just noticed that the rain drops made these really interesting rivulet patterns along the surface of the wings, and the way that they sort of folded around the ailerons and other bits is like, and I made a quick sketch in my notebook. I mean, more as an aid memoir rather than actually as a direct piece of drawing.
mm,
So when we came to do those shots for real, it's like, okay, well, we should be doing these kinds of rivulets over the wings, and they should have these kinds of properties. And you get a lot of, again, buy-in, because it feels right, because it is right.
mm,
And so, yeah, I mean, the going out in the world, and also the going out in the world and looking at culture that is not movies.
mm,
Whenever I go and talk to students, and it tends to be sort of visual effects students more than art students in general, it's like, okay, who are your 5 favorite painters? Who are your 5 favorite photographers? Who are your 5 favorite graphic designers?
mm,
Who are your 5 favorite comic book artists? And if you don't have answers for those, why not? Why not?
mm,
Go and engage with stuff. Go and look at paintings.
mm,
My picture making is one of the first things that humans ever did. And one of creativity is literally the only thing that separates us from other animals.
mm,
But we've since we first figured out how to spit ochre onto the wall of a cave, we've been making pictures,
mm,
and there are so many ways of doing that, and there are so many ways of humans expressing themselves throughout history. Just go and look at things, and it's good for the soul. It will make you into a better artist. And if somebody is still not convinced, and they are very kind of, well, I just want practical examples of why this is good, the other reason why you do it is because that's the language that everybody else in every other department on a movie is going to use. So I remember I did a project that was going to be very sort of gothic horror kind of show. And
mm,
the first meeting I had with the director, there was a script, but there was no concept art, nothing. And is a director who is very known for making pop promos, so kind of very visually driven person. And the meeting basically, I sort of said, well, have you got an idea for a visual style for this thing? And he said, yes. He said, do you know Caspar David Friedrich? And I said, yep, I'm fully aware of my German Romantic painters. And he said, do you know the one of the graveyard where there's a big sort of gate at the end of it and there's a fixed? I went, yep, I know that picture. He said, that's what I want my movie to look like. It's like, great. Now we can have a sensible conversation about how this movie is going to look because we have a shared point of reference.
Yeah.
So that's the boringly practical reason for going and immersing yourself in other art. But the main reason is just because it's good for the soul.
Yeah. I often think as well about your part of the industry, about the kind of sweet spot between having enough detail in the shot for people to believe it, but also kind of working out the level to which people perceive things and what you can also not put in the shot. How do you go about kind of making those judgment calls? I mean, I've had situations in my life where I've thought I've seen one thing, I've blinked, look back, and there's something else, because the way we perceive things, it's just an input, from our eyes to our brain, and our brain is trying to do its best job of, telling us what's in front of us. But in the movie world, you're trying to often recreate reality. Where is that line? Where is that sort of sweet spot?
I mean, I think the rule of thumb that and I think everybody else would always use is, one of the main jobs that the director has is to guide the viewer to look at particular parts of the screen.
Yeah.
And we are very sensitive to that. So the place where people are going to be looking is where we're going to focus most of our effort. It's an interesting thing because I feel that this has changed a lot. Now everything is 4K and people are using sharp lenses. I mean, if you go and watch a movie, an older movie that was shot on and is being exhibited on 35mm, it's so soft. It's unbelievably soft. And you go and look at matte paintings for whatever, Star Wars or Blade Runner or anything like that, and there are huge areas of those images that are super loose.
Yeah.
The brushwork is so loose, but it's brilliant because it gives the impression of the thing that's there. And then there'll be bits that are painted with exquisite detail, which is where the eye is going to be. And we can still kind of do that, but in a world where everything is very 4K and people kind of get obsessed by resolution and detail and all of that kind of stuff, it's less true now. So I think there is more focus across the board.
Yeah.
And you certainly look at, say, Marvel movies where the whole aesthetic is super crisp, super vibrant colors. Just everything is really clearly delineated because that's the style of the thing. It's like, well, there's kind of no way to hide there, and that's that's their shtick. Compared with something like an Ex Machina, where the movie was shot using JDC, Joe Dunton cameras, Crystal Express lenses, which, for lens nerds, were old spherical Cooke S3s, I think, that he then went and put anamorphic elements on front and back.
Mm-hmm.
And they were used on Return of the Jedi and all of those kinds of movies. But the thing with anamorphic lenses, particularly older ones, is that they're not designed to be used wide open. You're generally supposed to stop them down to like T8 or something. And Rob doesn't like that. Rob likes shooting at T28. That's his stop. Which meant that we had a whole world of crazy optical business happening, particularly at the top and bottom of the frame, that we had to handle. And so we were like literally warping geometry in our CG to get it to line up with what's in the camera, not because the real life geometry was twisted, but because the camera rendered it as such. But it has a look and there's a softness to it, and it helps bed everything together, and it has a different aesthetic, and certainly you kind of can then focus on, well, this is the thing that we're going to focus on, and these bits will sort of fall away. So it does depend on the job, I think, and also it depends on the technology that's being used to shoot and exhibit it.
Yeah, there's such scrutiny now, though, with, like you say, with 4K and everything else. People want to be able to pause every single frame and pull it apart.
Yeah. Well, and it's, we were lucky when we started Indie to see Steven Spielberg's personal 35mm print of Raiders.
Wow.
That movie is so dark. It's crazy dark. I mean, it's shot with 5247 stock, which is very contrasty anyway. So the shadows, everything just plugs up. There is nothing in those shadows. It is black, and similarly, it blows out really quickly. But that's the aesthetic of that time, and that's why all those movies look the way that they do. But modern audiences are not up for that, and that became one of the conversations, particularly for the opening sequence in Dial of Destiny, where we're sort of going back to Indy in his pomp. It's like, well, how much are we trying to make this feel like a Dougie Slocum shot early mid-80s indie movie, and how much do we have to kind of respect modern cinema audiences' expectations? They expect to see detail in the shadows. They expect not to have every highlight blowing out to white. And so there's definitely, not just us in visual effects, but Faden, when he's shooting it, is, there's some bits where he's definitely going, oh, yeah, I'm going to give a nod to Dougie here. But then these other bits, it's like, no, this is going to be more us. And that relationship between the new and the old is something that we had to work on a lot. I mean, the interesting, well, nerdily interesting thing to me, and I know this because I went and counted it up. Faden and Jim Mangold are very close-up centric filmmakers. That's what they like. Steven Spielberg and Douglas Slocum, not so much. They're all more mid shots. So there are more close-up, like real close-ups of Indiana Jones in the opening reel of Dial of Destiny than there are in Raiders, Temple of Doom, and Last Crusade combined, which is bananas, but it's where we are.
Yeah. There's certainly a different look about it. But you talk about trying to recreate Indy there in kind of his prime. I mean, again, another hugely bold ambition. I mean, to pull that off. And I know that it's easy in the marketing to kind of say it was ILM face swap or whatever, which I'm sure it's actually a dozen tools combined and hundreds of people. But that was a hell of a thing to pull off, because in the similar way that Spielberg used to talk about Jurassic Park, if you don't believe that first dinosaur you see, the movie's kind of done. You got that moment with the bag off his head. If you're not buying that, then you're kind of done.
Exactly. I mean, that's the first shot we started working on. It's like, all right, well, let's just rip off the Band-Aid. We're going to do the hardest one first. But that's again going back to the psychology of making films. It's like Jim's totally doing this deliberately. It's like, it's like you pointing at us, ILM, have got to sell this. But we're gonna get straight in there. We're not going to hide in the shadows for a bit and all the rest of it. It's just like first shot, bag off the head. There he is. There's Indiana Jones. And it's and if we can get those shots to work, it buys us a lot of credit for the rest of the sequence, which is true and is very smart filmmaking. But I remember the first meeting after I'd done the interview with Jim, where we mostly talked about banjos, because he's a keen banjo player and he had a banjo in the background, so we talked banjos and old movies. But the first proper actual work conversation we had, he said, well, how are we going to do young Indy? And I sort of went through all of the different techniques that you can use, for CG head, or we can do some paintwork to take out creases from the plate, and obviously there's this sort of machine learning based approaches. And he was going, yeah, which one are we going to use? And all of them. And we did. And the face swap is a suite of tools, because we were equal parts smart and dumb. So we were smart enough to know that there wasn't going to be one tool that we were going to be able to use to do this whole thing. But we were dumb in that we thought, well, we're probably going to find that there's going to be a recipe where, the eyes are always done this way and the cheeks are always done this way and la la la, which was absolutely not the case. I mean, it ended up being that every single shot was its own kind of collage of techniques and all the rest of it to get it to work. But the thing and the reason for calling it face swap, and the reason, no one's trying to be vague particularly, but it's like it's a bunch of different technologies. And the thing that we needed to be able to do was to give the artists all of the different ways that you can stick a face together and then have them be able to kind of using their skill judgment, and they're spending their time looking at what Harrison looked like and making those calls to piece it together to make each shot. And it was enormous amount of labor, huge amount of labor, and a huge amount of labor of really, really skilled artists who had put in the time looking and understanding to get that. Because you've got two sides. You have to have the likeness, but there's the performance as well.
Yeah.
And if you don't have the performance, we're just as dead as if it doesn't look like 40-year-old Harrison Ford.
Yeah. So how do you kind of ensure that between the plate maybe shot with what is Harrison, late 70s?
It was 78 when we shot that.
Between, Harrison now and all the technology in between and the final result, how do you sort of ensure that Harrison as the actor is still driving that performance?
We try not to do too much hand animation unless we need to. So everything, whether it's full 3D CG, is driven by what he's doing on set. And same with the machine learning, is it's analyzing the footage and then suggesting what it thinks things should look like, and all of those bits coming together are all being basically driven by what's in that scan. So it's the thing that can be tricky is that an older person's face moves in a slightly different way to a younger person's face. And I know on other projects where they've started cutting with an older performance, there will be aspects of it that they fall in love with. It's like, I just love the way this creases across his forehead in this shot. And the one thing that we did, and the main way that we used a lot of machine learning as an semi-automatic process, was on the circle takes, which are the sort of selects that the director likes from each setup. We would run a machine learning low-res pass on it, so they would get in the cutting room. They never saw the original material. They saw the material with a sort of box around Harrison's head with a low-res version of the face, but you felt the performance, and that's what they cut with.
Right.
Initially, until we were starting to deliver better versions. And I think that was really key, because it meant that Mike McCusker, the editor, was always used to looking at a younger face, and so he didn't fall into that trap of falling in love with something that we really shouldn't have.
Yeah, I just think, our perception, I go back to that kind of Jurassic Park example. We've not seen dinosaurs move before, so we just have to kind of buy. Now we're getting into the realms of, Watchmen, where there's a CG character and we're looking at him move, and maybe the animation on the mouth isn't quite up to scratch. And then we're getting to Dial of Destiny, where you're getting to the point where at points it's difficult to know. You're not even thinking about it.
That's what we want. That's all we want.
The complexities of the human face are just infinite. I mean, I'm even on this call now, I'm sort of kind of reading your face and your expression and the nuance of all those things. It must be really difficult to kind of say that isn't quite right, but it's so difficult it's easy to say that isn't quite right, but it must be super difficult to pinpoint what isn't right about it. What is that little?
Yeah, I mean, you what you have to do is you have to look back at the previous versions of the shot, and is there something that we've lost? In which case you can kind of directly A/B them and go, oh, well, that's different. Okay, maybe it's that. You also have your institutional knowledge that you developed over the time of working on it, of just looking at it and going, oh no, nasal labial folds. Or the other thing which we did was we wrote a tool that would make thumbnails, like 5 thumbnails of scans from the original 3 movies of the face as close as we could get to what we had in frame. And so they would just like animate and twinkle away at the bottom. And that was very, very useful for me, because when I'm being center shot, it's like, is this working? Or this bit I think's working, I'm not sure about that. Is I could look at these other things, and it's like they weren't an exact match, but you could see, oh, do you know what? When he smiles, this corner of his mouth goes up more this way, and actually the way his eyelids work is that his top eyelids kind of disappear into his head. So we're not quite getting that. And those tools enable you to make better choices. So but it's iterative. I mean, some of those shots we went through 80 versions of before we got to the one.
You were talking about sort of referring to those original movies. Did you also have access to like behind the scenes material or kind of outtakes or B-roll of any kind?
Some. There wasn't that much. What there was, which was incredibly useful, was the publicity stills, and the ones that were super, super useful is that for raiders, some kind genius, unaware of how helpful they were going to be to future visual effects artists, did some amazing headshots of Harrison, black and white 10:8, which had been scanned at some point at stupidly high resolution. So when you're building the full CG head, and you literally do have to worry about where every pore is and what the quality of every pore is, you're not ever going to get that off the shots in the movie, because with the best will in the world, I don't care what resolution you scan 35mm anamorphic at, you can scan it at 2 trillion K if you want. You're not reading the license plates in the background of the shot, and you're certainly not being able to perceive pore detail, which we needed because we live in a 4K world where you can see that and people expect to see that. But because we had these publicity stills, and there were also some ones that I think were done for Empire Strikes Back that were color and shot on a Hasselblad, and they were lovely as well. Not quite as good because obviously it's a slightly smaller negative, well, quite a bit smaller negative, but still very good quality compared to 35mm. We were able to look at those and then apply that to the fully CG aspects of the build that we were doing. So yeah, we were greedy, and we hoovered up everything that we could and that people would give us. But I mean, I'm not even sure really where all the neg was. And this also was at the time of COVID, so lots of you couldn't get access to a lot of the archives because the archivists were at home and they weren't allowed in. So even if the B-roll, they said yes, it's on this shelf somewhere, they wouldn't be able to get it, and there would have been no one to scan it. So we were limited to what had already been scanned, and they had done rescans of all the movies very recently, I guess, for 4K Blu-ray release. So we had very good quality, or as good quality scans as you could hope for of the movies. And then we raided the archives for everything we could get.
Raided the archive. Raided is being the right word.
It is.
Is there any sort of part of you that when a new tool arrives that can do something better, is there any part of you that thinks, I'd like to have another go and, kind of improve on what I'd learned? Or are you one of those people that's always looking forward to the next project and the next challenges?
I tend to try and look forward to the next project, because closure on a movie is a really important part of maintaining some kind of mental health. So the deal that we all make with ourselves is we're going to make the best pictures we can given the resources we've got available. And then we hopefully do that, and then it ends, and then you think about the next thing. So there's nothing that I want to go back and redo, just because the post-traumatic stress disorder of it is I don't want to have to deal with that. And I just want to do something different. It's making a movie is so intense, and often for quite a long time. I mean, an average, I'm on a movie for like a year and a half on average, and India, I was on it for 3 years, non-stop, like literally non-stop for 3 years. And you have to let it go. Otherwise you're just going to go crazy. So yeah, I'm hyper focused about the thing I am currently working on. And then when it's done, it's like, okay, put that aside, go and play a guitar for a bit until you feel better. And then what's the next thing?
Well, I hope you enjoyed my chat there with Andrew Whitehurst. Thank you, Andrew, for your time. Coming up, I have my chat with the very interesting Ty Ruben Ellingson, another VFX supervisor. He's also an educator. My conversation with Marianne Infield is coming up too. She was somebody who worked at ILM as a camera assistant and some other effects houses in the 1980s and 90s. Often the only female member of the team. Yeah, we had an interesting chat a few weeks back. John Spira is coming back on to the podcast to talk about his latest documentary project, all about the legendary actor Christopher Lee. And I've recently spoken with production designer Kevin Jenkins. So that's coming up soon too. As usual, there's lots going on in the background here at Filmumentaries HQ. Keep across the socials on Facebook, Twitter, still calling it Twitter, Instagram and Threads. Oh, and YouTube too. I'm putting some more videos up there, video shorts and also full episodes on video, which if you're a certain tier of Patreon, you'll get early. Please don't forget you can support the podcast by visiting patreon.com/Jamie Benning or by buying a t-shirt from the T-Mill store, or perhaps by buying the Return of the Jedi book that Justin Berger and I put out last year. All the links are on my link tree, which can be found either on the show notes of this episode or any other episode, and it's also on my social media profile on whatever platform you look at. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you can do so for the next episode of the Filmumentaries podcast.
We are being way